Good day. I'm Jim Winship for Diplomatic Connections magazine. Today we're with Ambassador Dr. Michal Mlynár of the Slovak Republic. He is permanent representative and ambassador to the United Nations. And Ambassador, we're delighted to have you with us today. We share something in common, and that is that we both began our careers as academics, as teachers. And not to say that diplomacy does not involve teaching, but how did you make the move from teaching to diplomacy?
Well, maybe you should first know that I graduated high school and started my university studies in the old days, so to say, during the communist regime in former Czechoslovakia. And at that time, there were not too many opportunities for young people to study diplomacy. Pretty much the only one at that time was gone to Moscow to study diplomacy there. And I liked languages, including Russian. My first love was English, but I didn't quite fancy the idea of going to Moscow and studying there for practical reasons. So I thought that pretty much the closest alternative to diplomacy would be foreign languages. And at that time, if you wanted to study so-called Western language, you had to take Russian with it, or some other subject areas. You were simply not allowed to study two Western languages. I wouldn't have been able to do English and Spanish or English and French.
Understood.
So I ended up focusing on English and Russian, and also ended up teaching. And it was always difficult to decide, whether to focus, to continue focusing on foreign languages or maybe take up something else. But in the end, my plan worked out that focusing on languages was actually one of the potential and possible ways to also do foreign relations and diplomacy. But I have to add that there was a Fulbright year that I spent in Los Angeles that really had a profound influence on me deciding then to try foreign service, apply again, and focus on it entirely. I was a teacher first for about 6 years. Then I did my Fulbright year, as I said, in Los Angeles, and afterwards I really was very energetic and very much really focused more on trying something where I would be able to apply my knowledge and my experience, my skills for the service of the country.
Yes.
Because I think there is an important word that we should not omit when speaking about the foreign service, and that is the service. That first and foremost, it is a service to your country.
Yes.
So I first joined the Foreign Service, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovakia, as a protocol officer and as an interpreter. That was my beginning.
So that was the bridge between language and...
Exactly.
Yes.
So the languages really enabled me to make that transition.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because I'm always fascinated. I mean, language is obviously a mode of communication, but it's also a cultural synthesizer. It's a cultural avenue as well. I mean, it talks about understanding a language also involves values and understanding a culture. Obviously, you devoted a great deal of time to English as well as to Russian, and you have language skills. How do those language skills, beyond just simple communication, and not that that's simple at all, but beyond communication, translate into diplomatic skills?
You're right. It's primarily about communication, and of course, diplomacy is also the art of communication to a great extent. But of course, it would be probably almost empty if it was communication without the substance.
Yes.
So we need to add the substance, and the way I would add it is that you really need some additional life experience. I mentioned the Fulbright year in Los Angeles, which added to that. And I often, even when interacting with younger diplomats, either in our foreign service in Bratislava or elsewhere, including here in New York, I often tell them that it's probably not necessarily such a good idea to enter the foreign service immediately after university, that they should do more. They should use the vast opportunities for internships, for junior positions, whether it is in the international organizations or it is maybe with NGOs in places like Africa and others, where really they can gain the invaluable life experience.
There's something to be said for on-the-ground experience beyond the classroom.
Absolutely, and it was like that in my case, not only through my teaching career, but after having served for the first time here in New York as a political coordinator for Security Council issues and as deputy permanent representative. I then had the opportunity of serving my country as ambassador to Kenya,
yes,
to 11 other countries in East Africa. And I really call it a defining experience.
And to UN Habitat as well, was that correct?
Yes. There was. I was permanent representative to the UN agencies in Nairobi, UN Habitat, UNEP, and also the United Nations office at Nairobi.
I'd like to perhaps come back to that at some point, but I think that's another aspect of diplomacy that often people don't see from the outside, which is this idea of how many ambassadors wear multiple hats. And as you said, 11 different countries in Africa, as well as being based in Kenya.
It was a challenge, of course, because covering 12 countries total plus the UN agencies is not an easy job.
It's a recipe for schizophrenia, I think.
Almost. And really, many of these are countries where there are serious challenges, whether from the point of view of peace and security or from the point of view of socioeconomic development.
Of course.
And others. But it was almost, I would say, an ideal combination for me, that having served in New York first and including on the Security Council in 2006 and 2007, and then going to Africa really gave me a special perspective of Africa.
Really moves you from the policy end of the spectrum to the implementation end of the spectrum.
And Nairobi in particular was really almost an ideal pick, I would say, even though before going there I didn't have much of an idea about life there and about so many other things. But this is another similarity between education or teacher's career and diplomacy, that it is a lifelong journey of learning.
Yes.
And of course, if you are open to learning experiences, it usually works well also in the diplomatic circles.
I was tempted to ask how your Swahili was, but
I should in Swahili say kidogo, which means I speak a little. I can
Shabo Rafiki Habari. So
Missouri Sana, and I was used to at least introducing myself.
And that's something about language learning that I think people sometimes don't realize is one language is not identical to another, but the learning process teaches you things about learning languages and picking up.
Exactly. Once you speak a few and you understand the concept of language learning, then it certainly it is much easier, and we would probably in Europe call it a snowball effect. That things somehow pile up. But also during my Fulbright year in California, one of the classes that I was taking with well-known professor John Schumann was neurobiology, principles of second language acquisition.
Oh my goodness.
So that also gave me some sort of an insight into what happens in your brain
Exactly.
when you are trying
Exactly.
to learn a language. But
Fascinating.
let me add that it's usually very individual. Some people are quick and easy language learners, and others are not, which does not necessarily mean that that they are no use. But we are not the same.
No, I used to say in 2 or 3 different languages, I was good enough to survive on the street and good enough to get into trouble, but not out of trouble. So,
yes, sometimes we say in Slovak that you should have the survival kit knowledge of language in order for them not to sell you, or for you not to get sold.
yes,
That's
yes.
the way we usually
Understood.
say it. And there's another thing we say in Slovak about learning foreign languages, that as many languages you speak or that many times you are a human being.
Aha.
So it's this multiplication.
With your permission, I may borrow that from Slovak for the rest of whatever is left of my career. Let me change directions from your career development, which is fascinating in itself, to Slovakia at the United Nations. What's the importance of the United Nations to Slovakia and your country's diplomacy, especially at a time where multilateral institutions of all kinds seem to be under severe attack by kind of resurgent voices of nationalism around the globe?
It's key for us. I should add that even though Slovakia was admitted as a new UN member state after the split up of Czechoslovakia in January of '93, we were not new to the UN
Yes.
circles, because we proudly refer to our former country, to Czechoslovakia, as one of the founding members of the United Nations. And it is actually one of my distinguished predecessors, Dr. Jan Papanek, who was among the 14 experts who actually drafted the UN Charter.
Yes.
And let me also add that he was a Slovak. We have some important roots that we can really refer to. But in the modern era, it is really crucial for us to be member of the United Nations and to engage on all the important global issues. For us, key priorities, of course we have priorities in all 3 pillars of the United Nations, peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. And we have served in all important UN organs throughout the 26 years of our existence as Slovakia. We were members of the Security Council 2006-2007. This is now the second time that we are serving as member of the Human Rights Council. We were also member of the ECOSOC.
Yes.
But it's just to confirm that we are engaged on all important areas. For us, engaging in the multilateral context is really, it has always been a key principle and key value of our foreign policy that has never been questioned, or that has never really been discussed. It was taken as a given that being part of the UN family is critical, and it is even more so today when we see attacks on multilateralism, when we see erosion of what we can call rules-based order, or erosion of multilateral values. And we really strongly believe in the importance of re-engaging and really confirming our complete commitment to rules-based order.
Yes.
And to the basic values of multilateralism. And often we are being asked how the UN can be more relevant and how really UN can better deliver on all these important global issues. And I think the most important part of the answer is that the UN is only as good as we 193 member states can collectively make it. So it's incumbent upon each and every one of us to spare no effort. And if we do that, then the UN will be better, and then we will be better able through the multilateral channels to address all the key global issues such as development, poverty, humanitarian aid, but of course peace and security issues, as well as others such as climate change.
If we could talk just a little bit about your country's history. I was fascinated by the fact that, of course, Secretary of State Pompeo recently paid a visit to several of the Eastern European, Central European nations. But as I researched for the interview, I was particularly fascinated by the photos of Secretary of State Pompeo and your foreign minister standing next to the bust of Woodrow Wilson. And I wonder if you could just explain a little bit of that significance. I think it would come as a surprise to a few people, at least, that the bust of Woodrow Wilson is there in the courtyard of the foreign ministry.
Yes, we are really very proud of that particular bust, but it's just a materialization of the importance that we attach to the role that former President Woodrow Wilson played in the origin or in the setup of Czechoslovakia after the First World War.
It was point number 10 of the 14 points? I may be off on my point.
Yes, you are right. And let me just finish on the bust, that it was actually a joint effort of a group of our ambassadors. We actually, this was not public money, but this was, our private finances that we together collected. And there was a coordination committee that worked on that, and that we ended up putting that bust and putting it in the courtyard of the foreign ministry as a strong symbol of the friendship and cooperation between Slovakia and the United States, and as a recognition of a really critical role that the United States, through President Wilson at that time, played in the creation of Czechoslovakia. Without the role of the United States and without really personal and vital involvement of President Wilson, things would probably have not happened, the way they did after the First World War, after the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was not taken for granted, that Czechoslovakia would be created, but it is thanks to the important engagement of later President Masaryk, Foreign Minister Beneš, who was the second president, and Minister of Defense Stefanik, that they were able to forge that important strategic agreement and forge the strategic support from the United States. So we were really happy that as we celebrated last year the 100th anniversary since the creation of Czechoslovakia, that we were able now this year, after many years, to welcome Secretary of State Pompeo on a bilateral visit of Slovakia, because the previous one was held in '99. It was Madeleine Albright who previously visited Slovakia on a bilateral visit, And so it's been, I would say, it's been high time now for a new
Yes,
bilateral
yes,
visit
yes.
by Secretary of State Pompeo. We are very grateful for that. Of course, other secretaries of state in the meantime have visited, but for other reasons, not necessarily.
As a bilateral.
As a standard bilateral
Yes.
visit. So really, this was a symbolic moment, and we are extremely grateful, and that memory is now strengthened, and we really try to do more, also as diplomatic service, to educate our young people about that, because that chapter of our history for a long time, of course, was neglected. The
Yes.
communists were not necessarily eager to keep this part of our history in the history books.
Let me, while I have you on that historical track, let me ask one other historical question that I think is of interest to people, and that is, of course, Czechoslovakia came out of the Soviet Empire in what was called the Velvet Revolution, and then in 1993, the Czech and Slovak republics, if you will, separated in what was called the Velvet Divorce at the time. Was that Wilsonian principles of self-determination, or was it sort of latent ethno-nationalism rising its head again that brought about the split?
Yes, historians have, of course, written books about that, and I'm sure there are lectures that are devoted to this whole topic. So I don't know how much I can aspire to
give you 2 minutes
to do that. But in a nutshell, I can say that you have to really connect the freedom part and the self-determination part.
Aha.
We gained freedom after November of 1989 with the important civic movement in former Czechoslovakia, led by President Havel, Alexander Dubček, and others who were able to really steer through the so-called Velvet Revolution, as you mentioned, and we were really proud to regain our freedom and to re-establish democracy. The first Republic of Czechoslovakia was really a well-functioning democratic state. So we had the democratic tradition that we could base our further developments upon. But of course, it was also the wider geopolitical context that played a role. But then later, a few years later, it was becoming increasingly difficult for the Czechs and Slovaks not to quarrel, not to focus on some of the differences.
Yes.
And in the end, it turned out easier to separate in order for us to be able to concentrate on the reforms, especially on the important political, socio-economic reforms, rather than keep discussing forever the nature of our joint cooperation and our coexistence in a common state. So as I was 19 when the Velvet Revolution started, and it started also at the Comenius University in Bratislava, where I was studying. So it was fascinating to be part of that student movement and to really participate in some of these important changes.
It's an affair of the heart as well as of the head.
Absolutely. And then I was about 22 when we split, and I was very frankly speaking, I was not happy at all about that. I felt at that time that the politicians should have tried more, should have spent more time. But of course, now I look at it in a bit different way.
Of course,
it was a political decision which at that time was probably the best way out. But luckily, we have managed to stick together in so many ways.
Yes.
And in fact, our relations are now better than ever before. We are now together members of NATO, of the European Union. In some ways we separated. In many other ways, our bond is even stronger,
Right.
which was demonstrated also through last year's centennial celebrations. Because we proudly, both of us, celebrate
Right.
Czechoslovakia as our first democratic state.
Well, there is some truth to the old English aphorism that absence makes the heart grow fonder at times.
Some people sometimes compare it to a marriage. That it so happens in marriages that people can no longer live together, but it doesn't mean that that they no longer like or love each other. Maybe it was necessary, but thank goodness that we made it an amicable
Yes.
split, and as you also mentioned, that it was another velvet process. It was a velvet divorce. Now we don't have to focus anymore on what potentially divides us. We can
Yes.
now freely and openly focus on everything that unites us, and there is a lot of that. And of course, we need to make sure that also for our young people, it continues to be the same. On the people-to-people level, in terms of culture, history, and of course our common future in
Yes.
in the transatlantic area and in the European Union.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this is not your first posting here at the UN in New York, but it's been, I think, about a decade, 10 years between the time you were deputy permanent representative and you're here again as permanent representative. I wonder what has changed in 10 years. How have you changed in 10 years, and how has the UN as an institution changed in 10 years?
Yes, well, there was 8 years in between these two postings, and 10 years since the time that we served as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. In many ways, this was homecoming for me, and I was, of course, very excited to be back and serving as your country's permanent representative to the United Nations is a great honor, a privilege, but also it is a strong commitment, and I'm determined to do my utmost to serve my country at the UN to the best of my skills and abilities. Yes, as a person, but also as a diplomat. In the meantime, I have had, in particular, this defining experience in Africa. So that gave me a very different perspective. I really believe a much more practical and much more realistic perspective of many of the global issues that we are discussing from all areas. My time in Kenya was special also because it was almost a perfect combination of focusing on economic cooperation, on political work, also on development cooperation, because Kenya happens to be the #1 priority for Slovak aid, for Slovak development cooperation, and I was really touring the country, visiting places and focusing also on our assistance that we provide to the people in communities in the area of education, health, and agriculture in particular. And also having served as chair of the Committee of Permanent Representatives to UN Habitat gave me another UN opportunity, but from maybe a less political and more practical and result-oriented perspective, and this is exactly what I was trying to do while I was there, and what I'm trying to somehow bring more to our work and our discussions here. How the UN has changed, we have a saying in Slovak that you do not enter the same river twice, and it cannot be more accurate. Of course, even though this environment is very familiar to me, many actors have changed, so that influences your work to a great extent. But more importantly, challenges are becoming greater rather than lesser, and the global arena is getting more complicated rather than less.
Yes.
So we really need to look at our position within the UN as Slovakia and our cooperation with others from a slightly different perspective. As I said before, we need to engage more. We need to maybe take certain things less for granted. Make sure that we pass the message on to also our younger colleagues, to the future generations. From the practical perspective, it is more challenging not only on the political level, but it is also more challenging in terms of the scope and the amount of formats that we are engaging in. And I don't know whether it's good or not. Of course, it has ups and downs. Often, if we cannot solve anything through an existing format, rather than engaging more in the existing format, we have a tendency of creating new formats,
Yes.
or additional
Yes.
working groups, or additional events, which is not necessarily always
Right.
the best way. But in the end, we really have a lot more to focus on, and a lot more to spend our time in. And as I said, I'm not necessarily sure that this is the best way, but still, of course, we are committed to doing our part.
Yes.
So this is probably the most visible change that I have noticed.
Well, and let me ask you to become even more specific for a moment. What are the key issues of concern for Slovakia at the UN today? I mean, what's your working agenda for Slovakia's national interests at the UN as we sit here?
Yes, as I said before, we engage in all three pillars of the UN work. I would highlight a few issues. On the peace and security pillar, we participate actively in peacekeeping operations.
Yes.
We are among the top contributors to peacekeeping from among the European Union member states, and we have been doing that for many years. Our greatest contingent is in Cyprus, but we also have military observers in Anzo, in the Golan Heights, in the Middle East, and then we have police personnel both in Cyprus and in Haiti, in Latin America. Our key priority since our time that we served as Security Council member in 2006 and 2007 has been the issue of security sector reform, or SSR. And it is really a critical component of the wider peace and security efforts that the UN focuses on, because often, especially in post-conflict contexts, but in other contexts as well, we see that without sufficiently focusing on accountability, inclusiveness, and efficiency in the security sector, we risk relapse to conflicts, to say the least, or we risk that conflicts would be more protracted and more deeply rooted. So Slovakia, together with South Africa, has been for more than 10 years now chairing the so-called group of friends of security sector reform, and we engage really on a daily basis. Just a few days from today, we will be hosting a high-level event focused on gender parity in security sector, which we are doing together with the group of friends of gender parity, chaired by Ghana and Qatar. In the area of socio-economic development, Slovakia has a unique experience of becoming a new donor. We ourselves were a recipient of assistance, not necessarily as a developing country or as a post-conflict country, but when we regained our freedom and when we started building independent Slovakia, of course we needed a lot of technical assistance, financial support from our partners, including from the United States, but from many others as well. Such as Germany, the Netherlands, Canada, our neighboring country Austria, and others. That experience, that transition, is something very unique which we have been able to share with many other countries, including in Africa. Even though sometimes when I started speaking about that, they were a bit surprised, whether or not a country like Slovakia would be able to share something with a country like Kenya, because traditionally we are quite far apart geographically, politically, historically, yet they were surprised how similar the trajectories could be and how much they actually, how much we can learn from each other. And these were really important experiences. Of course, other key priorities of our work today are implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, engaging very actively on climate change, and also following up on the recent priorities of by Minister of Foreign and European Affairs, Mr. Lajčák, who served as President of the 72nd session of the General Assembly. It is the youth. Probably it will not surprise you also from the point of view of my former career as an educator, but there is much more to it than that. We are now, together with a few other partners, looking at how we can really do more. I wouldn't say for the young people of this planet, but with them, and how maybe we can better listen to their needs, how we can better incorporate that particular perspective in our everyday work. So for that purpose, we are looking at potentially having a support structure that would engage with the Secretariat and with the UN agencies in order to provide a push for the UN to be able to better deliver jointly on the youth strategy of the Secretary General that was published in September of 2018. So this is another important perspective. And in general, within the UN, we need to have more people-centered perspectives. We need to always be asking ourselves a question of how does this particular resolution or how does this particular initiative benefit the people on the ground, or just even people in this city, in New York. We engage a lot with also with the representatives of New York City in practical terms. So I think that probably there is nothing more important than the people's perspective, and in that the engagement with the youth. And last thing that maybe I could highlight in this context is that we need to learn to listen to each other more. Often one of the key setbacks or one of the key challenges that we are facing throughout the processes in the UN is that we engage in a series of monologues, simply because there are so many things happening, or because we are understaffed or under-resourced, and then we end up just running from one meeting to another,
Right.
without really having an opportunity to reflect on what we are doing and listen to each other properly. So
It's interesting. One of the aspects of language learning, I think, that often is neglected or taken as sort of secondary is we speak, we write, but learning to listen in a different language. And I've, as I'm sure you did in your training, listened to hours and hours of tapes, but learning to listen in a different language is an art in and of itself, I think.
Absolutely. You and I know that there are four main language skills that any language learner focuses on, and listening is one of them. Without listening, somehow the learning process is not complete.
Right. No, I know. I always feel as though it's a landmark when I start in another language to hear the commas and the periods, and I know when a series of words ends, and in the beginning it's a sort of indiscriminate series of sounds, and then it becomes words, and eventually it becomes sentences and paragraphs, but those are all steps along the way that, as you suggest, Ambassador, translate quite directly into diplomatic skills as well. Let me not get away from peacekeeping for just 1 second, and I think if I could ask two questions there. One is, first, forgive my crassness, but let me put it crassly. What's in it for Slovakia in its involvement, its heavy involvement in the peacekeeping program of the UN?
Yes, as I mentioned, we have been involved in UN peacekeeping, but also we have provided our troops to EU and NATO operations in places like Afghanistan and Western Balkans, because this is part of our global responsibility. This is part of our contribution to making this planet a safer and more peaceful place. Of course, that's the overarching purpose. In practical terms, this is an excellent way for our soldiers to be more involved in theaters of operation. It is an excellent opportunity for them to gain the invaluable experience, which they, of course, cannot
There
gain.
is a training and readiness
Only
aspect to
exactly,
it.
only through training at home in their domestic context. And recently, Slovakia has taken over the coordination role of the whole Sector 4 in ANFICIP, in the United Nations operation in Cyprus. And in this particular country, in this particular context, Slovakia has been engaged in many different contexts for over 20 years. So this is yet another reason that we like comprehensive approaches. In areas where peacekeeping is necessary, where we have to deploy troops on the ground, we think that these efforts need to be coupled up with the necessary political efforts and development efforts. It was Kofi Annan who, during his tenure as Secretary General, so much emphasized the important linkage between peace and development. and the other way around, also between development and peace.
Yes.
There is really no development without peace, but there is also no peace without development. And in Cyprus, for example, Slovakia has been very active in hosting the so-called bi-communal talks between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots as a neutral facilitator and as an honest broker. So our engagement on the island really has an important position for us, and it is only natural that our political efforts, our mediation efforts, are also underpinned by providing our military troops. But in recent years, we have also recognized the important role of the policing component of the peace operations, because not everything could or should be dealt with by the military
Yes.
forces. Really good example is Haiti, but there are many other contexts. So we have increased our police participation as well. Often peacekeeping is the most visible part of the UN work.
Yes.
Not necessarily the best way that we should solve crises. I think we will all agree that it would be much better to focus more on conflict prevention,
Yes.
and on ways how we can prevent crises rather than needing to somehow address them and mitigate them. But of course, until there is a need, we will always be ready to continue our engagement
Yes.
in the peacekeeping area.
I'm taking shameless advantage of your time, Ambassador, so please forgive me, but there's one question I want to ask that I promised myself I would not let you get away from me on. And that question is, it's fascinating to read your background. You mentioned that people, the outside world, outside the UN, sees peacekeeping. They see the General Assembly. They see the Security Council. But you have, to me, one of the deepest and most fascinating backgrounds in the behind-the-scenes work of the United Nations. You mentioned, and I think people don't hear the expression outside UN circles very much, but there's a whole interior structure of the UN work that involves things like groups of friends, of which there are many, and various working groups. Could you tell us a little bit about that interiority, that inner working of the UN system day to day?
It's a relatively new method of work, if we call it that, because I think, if I remember correctly, the very first group of friends was set up in the early 2000s on Georgia. And it was invented by some Security Council members. Within the Security Council, they realized that they needed an operational structure that would allow them to get together in a smaller format to engage on important either territorial or thematic priorities, and to also to have something informal which would involve Security Council members, but also key actors that are not necessarily always among the membership of the Security Council. So this is how it all started, and over the years this has proven to be a very useful, practical, efficient tool of groups of member states getting together on a certain issue with a certain purpose in order to galvanize our interest and our support to certain issues. Of course, to ask sometimes even difficult or tricky questions and to demand answers, whether it is from the Secretary General, from his team, or from various other UN agencies, UN structures. In terms of the group of Friends of Security Sector Reform that I have mentioned and that we are co-chairing together with South Africa, we have always referred to it as the interface between the UN system and the member states. So I think the key element, the key purpose really is to bridge the gap that may occur between what the UN system does on a certain issue and how member states would like this to develop.
And we should say, these groups of friends are both voluntary and self-subscribing. I mean, they essentially generate themselves on the basis of interest in a specific problem.
Exactly. There is, it's completely voluntary. I have seen countries coming and going. Of course, the priorities for member states may change. So, maybe at some point a country was really engaged on certain issues, and then later it decides to no longer engage on those and choose a few others. Usually, groups of friends are set up at the initiative of a few that are some sort of facilitators or coordinators, and then they of course invite others to join them. Sometimes the membership is limited. Sometimes there is a certain geographical or political structure with which the group of friends has been designed, and is not open to anybody or to all member states. But in most cases, it is completely voluntary. In most cases, it depends on the country's preferences and on their expression of interest. And it has really worked very well as I mentioned, as an additional method of work, or as an additional tool. Yes. Of member states engaging amongst themselves, but also with the UN system, and also importantly holding the UN system accountable.
That said, here's a question I have never ever asked before, and I think it will be revealing to our readers. I have a sense, because I'm in and out of mission offices, but how large is your staff, and how do you deploy them when we start talking about groups of friends and UN agencies and the core institutions of the United Nations? How many people do you have to deploy?
Yes, it's a very good, very relevant question, in fact, because you can, because your priorities, your focus areas, they should be cognizant of your real capacities.
Yes.
That you have available, and our mission, of course, is quite small. Is not among the smallest missions. There are maybe countries and missions which have even smaller teams, but I wouldn't even call us mid-size. I would really refer to our mission as a smaller mission with 7 diplomats. So there is ambassador, and then there is deputy, and 6 line diplomats, so to say, covering
yes.
The 6 main committees.
And then there's a small support staff as well.
And then we have a few additional people on the administrative side.
Right.
Yes. So it's really a very lean team, but a very dedicated, very enthusiastic team, mostly comprising young people, for whom I strongly believe this is really a lifetime opportunity. This is for their careers a major boost.
Right.
That opens up larger horizons for them to be able to serve in the United Nations and to, on a daily basis, engage on
right.
important
well, and I wanted you to make the point that I would like our readers and listeners to understand, which is you are not working with a cast of thousands or hundreds or even dozens when you say 7 career stream diplomats.
A colleague of mine from, I would say, a very active and very well capacitated country who recently told me that he had 27 diplomats and that it was not enough.
Yeah.
But, and I had to agree with him, but when he asked me how many I had, of course the conversation was a little bit more more complicated then.
Well, you mentioned New York City before, and I almost said at the time, depending on the day of the week, the United Nations is seen as a great boon to New York City, and then at other times it's seen as a great burden to New York City. But what's fascinating to me is just the vibrant life that goes on, not only in the formal sense, but in the informal sense, sort of day and night with it. And I appreciate the fact that you use the word young, not in reference to either of us, but in terms of the staff. I mean, there is just an incredible vibrancy to, you know, what is sometimes called Turtle Bay that I think the world does not really see or understand at any level, but it is, as you said, it is an extraordinary training ground for the next generations of diplomats.
I think that it is not only about serving at the United Nations and, of course, engaging with the UN staff, engaging on all these critical topics. But from my own experience, prior experience, I can say that probably the most rewarding part of my colleagues' experience in their committees, for example, is to be part of the family of 193 member states and to engage amongst themselves.
Yes.
To really create partnerships, friendships, camaraderie, in a wider sense, across regions, across continents. Of course, for us, key pillar of our engagement and our foreign policy is being part of the European Union. We coordinate all the important areas, and we do our best to stick together and to to act as a united group of
Yes.
countries. But that doesn't in any way preclude us from engaging more and more with the others, with other regional groups, and with colleagues and friends that really cater for the truly global, multicultural, and multifaceted experience that New York and the United Nations provide.
It's astounding to me, and I'm sure it's an everyday occurrence for you, but the more I have worked in and around the United Nations system, the more often I hear from one diplomat that, well, I'm working with so-and-so now, and we were together in Washington as diplomats 10 years ago, or we were together in New York, or we were in Geneva together, that there is a level of personal interaction quite apart from official state representation that is an important part of what makes diplomacy work, I think.
Absolutely. We should not underestimate the humane component of our work. As you said, we often refer to it that way, that the world of diplomacy is small, that we meet sometime, someplace, and it often so happens that we meet again in completely different and unexpected contexts.
Yes.
Or places, which makes our work even more fascinating. But also in the negotiations, it is absolutely critical to realize that often we can make progress, we can achieve results when we are able to engage better as human beings.
Yes.
Of course, we all have our instructions from our political masters. We all have our national policies that we focus on. But it is about being able to forge consensus, being able to make compromises, being able to communicate, talk to each other. That that moves us forward. Without that, we would never be able to
Right.
achieve anything. Yeah? Because if we all end up being somehow entrenched in our own national policies, nothing would ever happen within the United Nations, and that's another worrisome trend that we experience almost on a daily basis. The unilateralism.
Yes.
And somehow overemphasizing that we defend our national interests. But I really firmly believe there's nothing wrong about defending our national interests. We all do that, and it is part of our job logically. But one thing doesn't exclude the other.
Exactly.
You can still continue defending your national interests, and yet be able to find solutions, be able to have compromises, or be able to forge consensus. In fact, maybe I should say that that part of our national interest should be agreeing in the wider context, yes, and really it should be for all of us in our national interest to find solutions. And if with this in mind, we will be able to make the UN more efficient and even more representative, even more delivering on its various priorities. And this is one of the areas that I have now worked on a lot, because together with my colleague, the ambassador of Jordan, we have been appointed by the current president of the General Assembly, co-chairs of the ad hoc working group for the revitalization of the work of the General Assembly, which is a long-term process that we have within the General Assembly in order to make sure that the General Assembly and its committees and all its work is fit for purpose.
That said, Slovakia held the presidency of the General Assembly last year. Your foreign minister, Mr. Michal, served as president of the General Assembly. What was that experience like, and what is learned from wearing that hat as opposed to wearing a distinctively Slovak hat?
Yes, of course, it was for the first time that a representative of Slovakia held the position of the president of the General Assembly. And
you have to wait 192 years to do it again?
Yes, probably. And it was an absolute privilege and honor for us and for Minister Lajčák to do that. We really approached also the preparations for that with utmost interest and with full commitment. It was, of course, I cannot speak completely on his behalf, but having worked with him very closely during the presidency and also in the preparatory phase, I know that the idea was doing our utmost and really contributing in all areas in the most inclusive and objective way possible. I mentioned that among the key priorities was the youth agenda, but there were, and of course I also mentioned the people-centered approach, which
in fact, the title, he has a new memoir actually of that experience out. And its title is not nation states come first, it is people come first.
Exactly. That was really the motto. It was the key priority throughout his presidency. I also already mentioned the issue of conflict prevention.
Yes.
And there is now within the United Nations the concept of sustaining peace and really addressing the whole peace conundrum through our efforts, whether it is peacekeeping or peace building, indeed conflict prevention. So he dedicated a large amount of time and energy towards streamlining and enhancing UN capacities in the area of conflict prevention, which is also a key priority for the Secretary General. So I'm really happy to see that throughout his presidency, Slovakia made a really strong contribution towards the UN agenda in all key areas, and that we were able to provide the necessary leadership in many of the key processes that I have mentioned, and the current president in many ways follows up on the same priorities, whether it is youth or it is the conflict prevention area and others.
We are coming to the end of the interview. I promise, as you know, my tendency is to feed you many questions, and you've combined many answers. Let me touch on one security issue and then a final wrap-up question. So much of Slovakia's history has obviously been wrapped up in the history of Europe and its empires, and quite literally, geographically, being stuck in the middle of Europe's empires and bouncing back and forth, disappearing from the map, literally for a time. But Europe has, in a sense, a new actor. Could you tell us from Slovakia's point of view what role China is playing in the region now, in the midst of the EU and NATO and Russia? Where is China fitting into that complex picture today?
Yes, you're right. China has been playing an increasingly active and increasingly visible role internationally, including in the United Nations. Just recently, actually, within our system, we have been looking at the various aspects of China's role within the United Nations. And also, as you mentioned, in our region, we see increased role that China is playing on the economic front. For us, we take China as any other partner within the international community. We engage with China very actively in various different formats, of course, including through the United Nations channel. You may know that there is this 16+1 format with China. Countries from Central and Eastern Europe that engage with it. We are part of that effort. But for us, of course, the key priority is staying together as European Union member states in the first place, and then, of course, also forging the unity of the transatlantic area, so sticking together on important strategic and peace and security related issues as NATO. So in no way, of course, one contradicts the other. But in the era of globalization, when we have new ways of doing business, we have new actors coming to the forefront. It is only natural that we engage more also with China. Maybe two more elements that I would add is number one, in the UN context, China is a permanent member of the Security Council, so it has a key role to play on peace and security, and it has been very actively involved on all sorts of negotiations in that context. And they always promote long-term approaches, and we are engaging with them on that because without their participation and their involvement, it is not possible to really move forward many of the processes. They are part of the G77 plus China group, and also the European Union has frequent meetings and frequent interactions with the G77 plus China, and there is no alternative to those. Often maybe certain things are somehow mystified, and we have seen repeatedly that when we are engaging more, when we spare no effort in communicating to each other, we can demystify certain things. Of course, there is a lot of discussions about trade and about intellectual property.
IPOs.
We are certainly not happy about cases of breaching international property, intellectual property rights. We are certainly not in favor of breaching WTO principles and all that. And I think the only way forward is to be open and to be engaging with China and others on these. When I served in Africa, I saw a really increasing role of China in the African continent, and I saw also that it had various different dimensions. Of course, for Africa, financing of development is critical. So China's role in that context is very important. At the same time, I think we need to be very careful about long-term solutions, about how then African countries are able to profit from the investments, how to bring the results of the investments or the profits to the people.
There is an element of potentially being exploited by the investments as well, certainly where your agricultural policies have intersected with China's very rapidly growing agricultural role, even to the point of the ownership of land in some places in Africa becomes a very delicate problem because, as you say, the investment is desperately needed, but what else comes with the investment is also a critical question.
Yes, and again, there is no alternative to discussing these things. I certainly don't like when these things are somehow exaggerated or when they are done in an aggressive way from either side. But I have seen also in Africa, how much everybody can benefit from orderly processes, processes where we stick to basic principles, where everybody knows which rules we follow, and when we are on the same page. So I think this is the way forward. Any potential twisting of rules, or any potential bypassing of rules, or any potential taking advantage of anybody doesn't work in the long run. It usually backfires.
I was about to say backfire was the very word I was going to use. I do have to say, Ambassador, you have been reinforced an idea I have had in the back of my mind, which is to write a book on what I'm going to call arithmetical diplomacy. Because we have the group of 77 plus 1, you have Visgrad 4 plus 1, we have the, the Bucharest 9, the 16 plus 1. There's a story behind that that I think is fascinating to tell. So
that's interesting. My wife is a mathematician. She works a lot with exact numbers or with
I knew there was a reason I left mathematics, and it was exact numbers.
So maybe I can put you in touch with her, and maybe you can compare notes about these things. Because speaking of which, I should add that there is really a great role that spouses play in diplomacy. This is maybe a role which is not always appreciated enough and highlighted enough. Here in the United Nations, it is especially important that spouses provide a lot of support to the diplomats, and they are the additional pair of hands or additional
Right.
brains, if you will, additional actors who also engage through various events, who, to say the least, help you implement.
And many of whom have careers of their own in the NGO sector or in public diplomacy.
Absolutely. They can contribute so much.
Yes. Yes.
They are not just mere bystanders or mere plus one.
Yes, yes.
But often they are actors on their own, and we should really take the best possible advantage of their participation.
I'm going to close, Ambassador, with a job interview question. Imagine that now, as you are very senior in your career, you have been placed in charge of the Foreign Service Training Institute for Slovakia. What lessons, based on your experience, and I'll say thus far in your career, what lessons would you want to be sure to communicate to young, fledgling, aspiring diplomats? Things that you wish, that you've learned that you wish you knew at 22 instead of in your 40s or whatever.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's interesting, and this is very attractive idea for me, because as
I'm lobbying for you with the foreign ministry.
As an educator, I do always try to have that education training perspective.
Yes.
And I never miss an opportunity to meet with students. We receive students at this mission for briefings throughout the year constantly, whenever they come to student conferences, Model United Nations
Yes.
events. We have a lot of interns, so we do create a lot of these opportunities, and we are always supportive of these learning processes. So it is already a natural part of our work and of my own engagement. Some of the lessons that I share with young diplomats within our system, or that I would emphasize even more if I was to play a more formal role in educating our young diplomats, would be never to take things for granted, never to somehow be complacent and just follow the mainstream. I have seen repeatedly in my professional career that it actually pays off to look deeper, to read more, to consult more with colleagues, with peers, to have as complete and as wide of a picture as possible in order for you to be able to make the right decision and to at least make the right analysis, because things are, even in the world of diplomacy, they are not black or white. Maybe we were used to bipolar world, unipolar world, polar world for some time, but now we have entered the era of multipolar world.
Yes.
How, if and how it already works, or how it is going to be working later, that's still, of course, a very open question. And in this multipolar world, future diplomats, young diplomats, need to really be equipped with the wide range of knowledge and skills. So number one would be not to take things for granted. Number two certainly would be that there is no alternative to what I call footwork. Meaning sitting in your office and writing your reports doesn't take you too far. You have to be out there in the meeting rooms, in the informal consultations, in meetings, and you need to engage constantly with partners. That's the only way that we are able to really move things forward. Often we underestimate that. We think that somehow things will happen on their own. They won't. And of course, lastly, we need to learn from our mistakes in the past. In general, we need to learn from the past, because often we were used to feeling that certain things will never happen again.
Yes.
Well, I'm afraid they could.
Yes.
Not maybe exactly in the same way, but in some other ways, certain things, certain bad, dangerous things could reoccur, and we need to be mindful of that.
And it's been said, history does not necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes.
That's also the way you can put it. Yes.
Yes. Well, Ambassador, thank you immensely
Thanks very
for your
much.
time. I appreciate it. And as I said, I take shameless advantage. I think we're pretty close to our 1 hour, so I appreciate it, and I appreciate your insights. We could go on much longer, but that would be selfish of me. So, for Diplomatic Connections magazine, I'm Jim Winship with the Ambassador of the Slovak Republic, Slovakia, to the United Nations. Thank you for joining us. Diplomatic Connections tries to build connections so that you will be connected. Thank you, and good day.